Dibawakan oleh penaja utama jelajah jiwa SME, Unify Business, rakan digital pilihan anda.
Assalamualaikum dan salam sejahtera. Anda bersama saya Nina Rozman dan ini Niaga Awani. Seperti biasa jam ini kami akan bawakan pelbagai rangkuman berita niaga ekonomi untuk kita meneliti bagaimanakah perkembangan dari peringkat tempatan hinggalah ke peringkat global. Dan kita akan mulakan dengan perkembangan ini terlebih dahulu. Perdana Menteri Datuk Seri Anwar Ibrahim berkata usaha kerajaan Madani memerangi rasuah yang sistemik serta membetulkan kelemahan struktur tabir urus negara terbukti dengan peningkatan kedudukan Malaysia dalam Indeks Persepsi Rasuah CPI. Beliau berkata kedudukan Malaysia yang melonjak ke tangga 54 dalam CPI dunia antara lain didorong oleh tindakan penguatkuasaan tegas pihak berkuasa.
Antaranya langkah tegas oleh Suruhanjaya Pencegahan Rasuah Malaysia SPRM, Polis Diraja Malaysia PDRM, Lembaga Hasil Dalam Negeri LHDN dan Jabatan Kastam Diraja Malaysia JKDM. Dalam perkongsian di media sosial, Anwar berkata, ini termasuk kejayaan memulihkan lebih 15.5 bilion ringgit hasil negara melalui rampasan aset, dana dan pembantrasan sindiket rasuah serta ketirisan yang telah lama menjejaskan kewangan awam. Sambil menzahirkan rasa syukur atas peningkatan CPI itu, Anwar berkata kerajaan Madani juga tidak berkompromi apabila integriti institusi strategik dipersoalkan. Perdana Menteri berkata tindakan tegas terhadap salah laku dan penyelewengan dalam sektor pertahanan di samping pembongkaran kartel serta rasuah berprofil tinggi menegaskan prinsip bahawa tiada siapa yang kebal daripada undang-undang. Pencapaian ini juga kata beliau adalah peringatan untuk pentadbirannya menggandakan usaha memerangi rasuah secara konsisten dan berani demi memulihkan keyakinan rakyat serta memastikan amanah negara terus dipertahankan. Berdasarkan laporan CPI 2025 yang dikeluarkan Transparency International TI pada Selasa, kedudukan Malaysia bertambah baik daripada tempat ke-57 pada 2024 ke tempat ke-54 tahun lepas. Menurut laporan itu, Malaysia di kedudukan ketiga dalam kalangan negara ASEAN selepas Singapura dan Brunei. Malah skor negara bagi tahun lepas meningkat kepada 52 mata berbanding 50 dalam penilaian 2024, menunjukkan trend menaik yang sederhana tetapi menggalakkan.
Malaysia telah memperbaiki kedudukannya dalam satu indeks rasuah global oleh sebuah badan pemantauan anti rasuah meskipun kerajaan digesa untuk berbuat lebih banyak bagi menangani kebimbangan dan mempercepatkan kemajuan. Dalam indeks persepsi rasuah terbaru, Malaysia naik 2 tangga ke kedudukan 54 daripada 182 negara selepas meningkatkan skor sebanyak 2 mata kepada 52 pada tahun 2025. Negara dinilai dari SIFA sangat korup hingga 100 sangat bersih dalam indeks yang disusun oleh Transparency International. Peningkatan skor Malaysia bagi tahun 2025 perlu dianggap sebagai satu isyarat potensi bukan alasan untuk berpuas hati. Menurut kenyataan Transparency International Malaysia, dan sudah tentu sudah bersedia dalam talian untuk bantu kita fahami mengenai perkara ini dan apakah antara perkara yang perlu kita lakukan pada masa akan datang adalah Aira Azhari, Ketua Pegawai Eksekutif IDEA. Saya nak ucapkan terima kasih Aira kerana sudi meluangkan masa bersama kami. Seperti yang kita dapat lihat, skor indeks ranking naik, namun daripada IT berkata kita tidak boleh, TI berkata kita tidak boleh berselesa, seperti isyarat mengatakan struktur kita masih lemah ketika ini. Dan apabila Malaysia sudah naik ranking tetapi IT kata jangan selesa, apa antara pembaharuan institusi yang mempunyai impak yang paling besar tetapi masih belum dibuat dan kenapa ia lambat?
Ya, selamat pagi Nina. Pada saya asas pendanaan politik sebenarnya adalah satu inisiatif pembaruan institusi yang akan menjadi, kita boleh kata, satu game changer lah kepada usaha untuk membantras rasuah di Malaysia. Dan kita tahu bahawa akta ini masih lagi belum digubal walaupun sudah menjadi, saya rasa, part of mainstream discourse lah dalam kerajaan dan juga dalam kalangan masyarakat ya di Malaysia sejak tahun 2016-2015 lagi, sejak skandal 1MDB mula-mula meletup dulu ya. Atap peranan politik ni memainkan peranan besar dan sebab apabila kita ada satu atap peranan politik, parti-parti politik di Malaysia sebenarnya harus mendedahkan sumber dana mereka. Jadi ini akan menjadi satu game changer dalam politik dan juga akan memainkan peranan dalam menghindarkan kes-kes rasuah daripada berlaku secara serius. Ya, dan kenapa lambat? Saya rasa mungkin sukar untuk akta ini mendapatkan sokongan kerana akta ini akan menuntut parti-parti politik mendedahkan sumber dana mereka dan parti-parti politik dan juga ahli politik kena wajib untuk menjadi telus dengan sumber dana mereka, dan juga akta ini akan meletakkan had kepada jumlah dana yang boleh dikumpul oleh parti politik. Jadi praktis yang diamalkan selama ini di mana kita tak ada ketelusan dalam dana politik. Jadi parti politik, ahli politik boleh mendapatkan duit dari mana-mana sumber dan juga dengan jumlah yang tidak unlimited lah dia punya amount. So saya rasa ini merupakan salah satu faktor lah yang menyebabkan sokongan politik itu sukar untuk didapatkan untuk kita gubal atau pendanaan politik ni. Walaupun ia akan menjadi satu game changer dalam politik Malaysia dan juga usaha membanteras rasuah.
Baik, sudah tentu ini adalah seperti yang Aira kongsikan, ini akan menjadikan satu game changer. Tetapi kalau kita nak melaksanakan perkara ini, apakah antara elemen-elemen penting yang perlu ada dalam kerangka agar kita dapat memastikan perkara ini dapat dilaksanakan, dapat dijadi game changer tanpa merisau ataupun menggugat kuasa-kuasa ahli para politik ini?
Sebenarnya saya rasa walaupun saya rasa there is no other way selain daripada kita kena buat saja dulu. So kita kena gubal je. We have to pass this law first sebab dia macam kita kena melalui kesakitan tu untuk kita dapatkan hasil dia. Sebab kalau kita nak tunggu sistem politik ataupun institutional reform yang lebih menyeluruh, ia akan mengambil masa yang lebih lama. Sebab untuk sistem pendanaan politik kita sebenarnya kita ada satu sistem yang betul-betul institutionalized dan betul-betul transparent. Ada reform lain yang kita perlukan lah, contohnya pendaftaran parti politik. Ya. Sekarang ni parti politik didaftarkan di bawah Registrar of Societies. Sama seperti persatuan-persatuan lain. Jadi bila kita samakan pendaftaran parti-parti politik di bawah ROS ini, dia punya threshold untuk ketelusan itu pun tak begitu tinggi. Jadi kita kena ada reform-reform lain seperti ini, tetapi saya selalu katakan bahawa akta pendanaan politik ini adalah langkah pertama. Langkah pertama yang sukar tetapi perlu diambil sebab kita kena ada ketelusan itu dulu. Dan kita kena ada had kepada limitation kepada donation, kita kena ada larangan kepada mendapatkan dana daripada luar negara contohnya. Jadi kita kena ambil dulu langkah tu, baru kita perbaiki, kita tambah baik di masa depan dengan institutional reform yang lain. Ya.
Dan sekiranya kita tidak ambil langkah ini dengan segera, apa antara kesan ataupun impak langsung terutama kepada kepercayaan pelabur dan juga integrasi keputusan kerajaan itu sendiri?
Ya, so kalau kita lengahkan lagi atas pendanaan politik ni, kita risiko untuk wang yang disalahgunakan akan meningkat. Ya, sebab dan juga kalau kita ada sistem di mana bisnes dan juga politik tu ada hubung kait ataupun ada hubungan yang sangat rapat, ya, the relationship between business and politics tu sangat rapat, bukan saja di Malaysia, di banyak negara dalam dunia, tetapi di Malaysia bila kita ada hubungan yang sangat rapat dan kita tak ada ketelusan, dia akan menjadikan risiko untuk polisi kita punya dasar tu dipengaruh oleh business interest. Itu akan menjadi, risiko itu akan menjadi lebih tinggi. Ya, so keyakinan pelabur, keyakinan kepada institusi akan terhakis. Jadi sebab tu saya katakan ini sangat penting. Mungkin yang kedua yang saya boleh tambah juga ialah pengasingan kuasa antara pendakwa raya dan juga peguam negara yang sedang dijalankan sekarang, yang prosesnya sudah dimulakan, dan saya harap kita akan lihat beberapa amendment lah tu Constitution untuk kita laksanakan pengasingan kuasa ini. Jadi ini satu lagi faktor yang sangat penting sebab bila kita ada independent AG dan juga public prosecutor ni akan menambahkan keyakinan juga kepada sistem integriti, mengurangkan persepsi bahawa kita ada pendakwaan terpilih, selective prosecution. So these two things sebenarnya saya rasa sangat-sangat penting lah. Ya.
These two things yang dapat memastikan kita tidak menjadikan sistem itu bias, dan apabila kita bergerak ke hadapan, sudah tu banyak lagi perkara yang perlu kita lakukan dan melihat kepada roadmap top 25 untuk impian kita pada tahun 2033. Sudah tentu kita nak lihat macam mana kita boleh ukur dan bukan sahaja cakap. Untuk melihat kepada target Malaysia ini, apa antara 3 milestone yang rakyat patut nampak sebelum 2028 untuk yakin ini betul-betul on track, mungkin daripada segi undang-undang, ketelusan dan juga penguatkuasaan?
Ya, jadi yang pertama tadi ialah atas pendanaan politik perlu diluluskan oleh Parlimen. Ideally sebelum PRU yang akan datang. Ini sangat penting. Yang kedua, pengasingan kuasa antara AG dan juga PP, peguam negara dan pendakwa raya yang sekarang sudah dimulakan proses itu. Tapi kita masih belum tahu perincian dia bagaimana, dia punya check and balance mechanism tu bagaimana. Jadi ini something yang kita perlu lebih detail. Dan yang ketiga yang saya nak tekankan, yang saya belum sebut lagi ialah MACC. Jadi SPRM, lantikan Ketua Pesuruhjaya SPRM. Saya rasa beberapa setahun dua ni ada banyak ketidakpuasan hati tentang sambungan kontrak kepada Ketua Pesuruhjaya SPRM. Dan baru-baru ini ada juga isu lagi tentang masalah integriti dan sebagainya. Jadi ketelusan dalam pelantikan Ketua Pesuruhjaya SPRM ni sebenarnya sangat penting sebab SPRM merupakan badan utama yang membantras rasuah, yang menyiasat kes-kes rasuah di Malaysia. Jadi saya harap kerajaan Madani tidak mengambil mudahlah tentang pelantikan Ketua Pesuruhjaya SPRM yang perlukan penambahbaikan, perlukan reform supaya prosesnya lebih telus dan kita kurangkanlah unsur-unsur di mana ada pengaruh-pengaruh lain yang mempengaruhi pelantikan Ketua Pesuruhjaya SPRM. Ini sangat penting saya nak tekankan. Ya.
Dan sudah tentu kita melihat ini adalah milestone yang perlu kita committed dan membawanya dengan penuh tanggungjawab. Tetapi kita bukan nak salahkan sesiapa. Kita tahu ini adalah usaha semua orang dan apabila berlaku kegagalan, kita bersama-sama harus kenal pasti apa yang perlu dilakukan untuk menanganinya. Tetapi siapa pemegang accountability jika salah satu milestone ataupun apa-apa milestone yang telah ditetapkan ini tidak dicapai?
Yang penting ialah kabinet lah. Sebab di Malaysia sebenarnya kita perlukan kelulusan jemaah menteri untuk apa-apa keputusan yang besar yang dibawa di Parlimen, di peringkat kerajaan, persetujuan dan juga sepakat oleh jemaah menteri itu sangat penting. Dan jemaah menteri sudah tentu diketuai oleh Perdana Menteri. Jadi penting untuk menteri-menteri kita yang memegang kuasa, memegang amanah untuk ada iltizam politik yang kuat untuk membantras rasuah. Dan membantras rasuah ni goes beyond awareness campaign, it goes beyond slogan. Dia perlukan satu tindakan memperbaharui, mengukuhkan institusi yang sangat serius. Dan saya tak kata ia mudah. Banyak perubahan-perubahan ini memerlukan pindaan perlembagaan, perlukan satu cultural shift saya rasa yang sangat serius. Jadi ini perlu diambil serius oleh jemaah menteri kita dan juga Yang Amat Berhormat Perdana Menteri yang saya rasa komitmen beliau kepada membantras rasuah itu kita tak boleh pertikaikan, tetapi ia perlu disusuli dengan tindakan yang serius dan tindakan yang jangka panjang. Dia bukan jangka pendek sahaja. Ya.
Baik. Dan itu adalah kita harus memastikan perkara-perkara yang kita dalam perancangan ataupun pelaksanaan oleh setiap pihak bertanggungjawab bukan sahaja untuk memikirkan bagaimana untuk kita melaksana ataupun memenuhi dalam tempoh jangka pendek, tapi sehinggalah kita memastikan kesejahteraan, ketelusan setiap sisi itu sehinggalah dalam tempoh jangka panjang. Sekali saya nak ucapkan terima kasih kepada Aira Azhari, Ketua Pegawai Eksekutif Ideas, dan setiap perbincangan ini akan kami rangkumkan dalam astro.awani.com dan di semua platform digital Astro Awani. Baik, kita akan beralih kepada perkembangan seterusnya dengan Salcom DG berhad secara rasmi melantik Alban Murty sebagai Ketua Pegawai Eksekutif berkuat kuasa Selasa. Pelantikan itu dibuat selepas satu proses pencarian menyeluruh melibatkan calon dalaman dan luar bagi memastikan kepimpinan paling berwibawa untuk menerajui syarikat.
Murty, 53 tahun, telah menjadi sebahagian daripada pasukan pengurusan Salcom DG sejak penggabungan Salcom dan DG pada 30 November 2022 sebagai timbalan CEO sebelum memangku jawatan CEO. Beliau membawa lebih 22 tahun pengalaman kepimpinan dalam industri telekomunikasi, termasuk 7 tahun sebagai CEO DG.com Berhad. Sepanjang kerjaya, Murty pernah memegang beberapa jawatan penting di DG, antaranya Ketua Pegawai Operasi, Ketua Pegawai Pemasaran serta Naib Presiden Eksekutif dan Ketua Asia muncul di Telenor Asia.
Kerajaan mentafsir artikel 6.2 Perjanjian Perdagangan Timbal Balas Art Malaysia Amerika Syarikat dengan melihatnya selaras dengan amalan takbir urus yang baik, prinsip persaingan sihat dalam aktiviti komersial dan selari dengan obligasi antarabangsa Malaysia. Kementerian Pelaburan Perdagangan dan Industri MITI berkata, semua komitmen dalam art ditafsir serta perlu diselaraskan berlandaskan kepada Perlembagaan Persekutuan, Perundangan Domestik dan Dasar Sosioekonomi Nasional. Kata MITI, kuasa ini bagaimanapun tidak mengenakan larangan mutlak terhadap semua bentuk sokongan kerajaan. Menurut MITI, bantuan kerajaan yang khusus diberikan untuk melaksanakan obligasi perkhidmatan awam termasuk keperluan pembangunan nasional, keselamatan dan sosial adalah dibenarkan memandangkan ia tidak dianggap sebagai bantuan bukan komersial yang menjejaskan persaingan secara tidak wajar. Kementerian itu berkata demikian dalam jawapan bertulis Dewan Rakyat bagi menjawab soalan Muhammad Syahid Cik Sulaiman PN Bacok mengenai bagaimana kerajaan mentafsir dan melaksanakan kuasa 6.2 Art Malaysia Amerika Syarikat. Crypto markets are once again under pressure, with prices correcting sharply after a period of optimism. But this volatility isn't happening in isolation. We are also seeing swings in equities, bonds, and even precious metals. So the big question today is this: is this just another crypto crash or part of a broader market reset? To help us navigate this downturn cycle, we're joined by Aaron Tang, General Manager APAC at Luno. I want to say thank you very much, Aaron, for joining me. We can see that crypto has been through multiple boom and bust cycles before. What triggered this specific downturn and what makes it different from previous ones?
Morning, Nina. Thank you for having me again. The interesting thing about this price movement this time around is that it is a lot more multi-factor, and the actual price movement has been slightly more gradual if you compare versus 2022 or if you compare versus 2018, 2017. So since the October 2025 peak of about 126,000, we have dropped to about 69, 70,000 right now. So that's a little bit more gradual than previous cycles. And I think there's several things that are quite different from previous cycles. So for example, now crypto digital assets are with a lot more institutions. So a lot more institutions have crypto and digital assets. Now these are many different types of institutions. So they may include companies like ETFs, so basically fund managers, but we also have a bunch of companies who are actively trading in derivatives and so on. So companies such as those, they will be very, very quick to enter and exit the market because they're trading basically on very, very short time frames. So that could be potentially one of the differentiation factors between now and previous cycles. It's also very interesting because we look at how crypto is behaving in a multi-asset world. So the sharp downturn or the sharp correction in cryptocurrencies, that actually at the start, you could actually see gold and silver moving much higher than cryptocurrencies. So that to us is a signal that at least for the past couple of months, crypto has not been behaving like a hedge against instability or so on, but rather it has been treated more like a risk asset, meaning that when people feel that they can take more risks, then they are buying crypto. However, in the past few months, people have been moving a lot towards safer, perceived as safer assets such as gold and silver. And then if you look at the final factor, I think in terms of sentiment, it's actually quite interesting right now that a lot of sentiment has moved to some of the other industries such as AI. AI is of course on everyone's minds, and crypto has not actually been on the tip of everyone's tongue. So I think it's a huge number of factors that are all contributing to this. I would definitely say that it is more macro factors than a specific happening within the crypto industry itself.
You mentioned that this more on the macro level, on one of the biggest factors is what's happening right now. And then is this more about global macro pressures like interest rates and liquidity, or crypto-specific factors such as leverage and market sentiments? What's your thought on this?
Definitely, it's leaning more towards the macro factors. So, for example, many people were saying that expecting interest rates to come down a little bit faster. Indeed, President Trump himself has been pushing for interest rates to move down much quicker. However, interest rates have been maintaining not that many cuts at the moment at the US Fed. And then, of course, we hear about things like potential instability in the Middle East, for example, the Iran, America challenges there, potential conflicts around the world. So I think that factors have played a lot of caution into the minds of investors and traders worldwide. Now, if you look specifically at factors within crypto markets themselves, so if we look at leverage, if we look at are there projects that blew up, or are there, for example, big systemic risks within the crypto industry, we have not actually seen huge companies or large companies, systematically important companies actually have huge problems. So again, if I'll go back to 2021, 2022, then we of course had a huge crypto exchange like FTX. They blew up. There was a huge amount of fraud happening and so on. So that actually has not happened in this last couple of months, and I would say that is more driven by macro.
Aaron, you also mentioned or share about the sharp turn, downturn, with the many factors behind it. And we're going to focus especially during downturns. We know that emotions tend to take over. From what you're seeing on the ground, how are investors reacting right now, and what are the most common mistakes made during periods like this?
Definitely, we've seen a dip in trading volume because I think investors are worried at the moment. So a lot of people are taking their time to either sell or hold on to their capital, right? Not investing a lot at the moment, not trading a lot. However, we also do have a segment of customers who are patiently still staying on. So these are what we call the long-term holders or the long-term hodlers. So they basically, even in the events of market volatility, they are maintaining their crypto investments because they are investing more for the long term. So I think a couple of common mistakes that investors make during these kind of phases is panic selling. So panic selling, I think, is when you let the emotions take over you, and then you sell perhaps out of your original investment plan. So for example, maybe your original investment plan was, I would like to hold for 5 years or so on, but because of market sentiments, investors may sell too early. The other thing that investors may often do is over leveraging. So in the crypto markets, not so much in the local crypto markets, but if you were to use offshore platforms and so on, you could get leverage to invest into crypto. Leverage meaning that you have $10, but the crypto trading platform may allow you to invest up to say $50 or $100 and so on. So in this kind of situation, if you're over leveraged, small market movements may make you lose all your capital. So I think this is also one of the mistakes that newer investors do. And I think the last one is, of course, the lack of diversification. So again, investing is usually traditionally you look at multiple asset classes. whereas sometimes people go all in on just one asset class. And I think that can be quite dangerous, because what happens if there's a correction in that specific asset, you don't have other assets to help you manage the other difficult times.
All right, this is definitely not easy to manage. As first, you mentioned that sometimes you have to balance between selling it early and other than over leveraging it. But let's make this practical. For the everyday retail investors watching at home, what should they realistically be doing right now? Should they be saying invested, reducing exposure, risk, or sitting on the sidelines? And just as important, what is one thing investors should avoid doing during a downturn?
Couple of guidelines that these are general best practices for investors, right? It's not specific to crypto, it's not specific to stocks, but I think people always need to assess their risk exposure. So when assessing their risk exposure, it's basically to understand, okay, do I have maybe 1% of my portfolio, 5% of my portfolio, 10% of my portfolio in a specific asset? In this instance, of course, it's crypto. So I think the general rule of thumb that I personally like is, if you're comfortable, you should not be getting anxiety, you should not be getting sleepless nights over the amount that you've invested in an asset class. So whether that amount is 1%, 5%, 10% of your portfolio, again, every person has different risk exposure, but people should be constantly understanding that, am I taking too much risk for my own portfolio? Now, in terms of if people are believing that, okay, this asset class is suitable for me, I want to continue to invest in it, cost averaging over longer periods of time, that has traditionally in the past, that has actually done very well, especially for an asset like Bitcoin. So instead of trying to time the market, okay, I try to time it when it's, I try to buy when low and then I try to sell when it's high, which most people try to do. You could instead invest at very, very fixed intervals. So perhaps every month I invest my 50 ringgit or 100 ringgit and so on. That's quite an interesting strategy. And I think most importantly, it's also something that you mentioned, Nina. If people are feeling uncomfortable, there's actually no harm or no shame to stay on the sidelines, to actually have that dry powder. So perhaps when you are feeling better with the macroeconomic situations, or you feel better about the market cycles, then you would be able to have the capability to invest back at that moment of time.
Getting comfortable and reducing our anxiety, but there's a lot of noise online also we need to consider, especially on social media. If we strip all that away, what key data points or indicators should investors actually be watching during any type of cycle, especially downturn?
Yeah, a couple of things that we watch very closely. So the first thing would be definitely global liquidity. So looking at how much the central banks around the world are interested. So basically, when interest rates go down, when central banks want to stimulate growth, then these are conducive environments for assets such as tech stocks, digital assets, and so on, to be doing well. So that's something that we watch quite closely. I think something quite interesting to also watch is in terms of the correlations between Bitcoin digital assets with other kinds of asset classes. So for example, in the past, people have looked and seen that traditionally digital assets have had a little bit more correlation with the with the tech stocks, and then not as much correlation with the gold, with precious metals like gold. So that could be quite an indicator for people in their portfolios. If precious metals are doing really well, then historically in the past, that may mean that it's not very correlated, and digital assets may not be doing well for that moment. Some other aspects that we tend to look at, these are what we call on-chain metrics. So because the blockchain, the digital asset world is information is available to everyone online, so people can actually look at the activity within the Bitcoin network itself. So for example, people could look at how many Bitcoin addresses around the world are actually being active right now. So that could give you a proxy into how active that people using Bitcoin are. And then you could also look at things such as the amount of mining capacity in the world. So mining capacity is basically also a proxy to indicate how much activity there are in the Bitcoin network. So again, if there's a lot of mining activity around the world, then that would possibly indicate in the short term, in the future, that there's a lot of belief, there's a lot of investment in the crypto industry.
All right. I want to say thank you very much for helping us understand how can investors or crypto players navigate, especially during the downturn of crypto cycle. And again, I want to say thank you very much. And that was Aaron Tang, General Manager APAC at Luno, for helping us make sense of crypto's latest downturn cycle. Please stay tuned with us as we will bring more updates on Niaga Awani.
Aiskrim Cadbury Hazelnut baru. Anda pasti terpikat.
Kementerian Pendidikan bertanggungjawab sepenuhnya terhadap keselamatan murid dan pelajar sewaktu mereka di sekolah.
Malaysia dan Korea Selatan terus memperkukuh kerjasama dalam bidang teknologi hijau dan kecerdasan buatan AI menerusi pelaburan dua syarikat utama Republik itu.
SPRM akan meneliti dan menjalankan siasatan sekiranya dapat unsur rasuah dalam pelaksanaan projek Aerotrain di KLIA yang dilaporkan sering mengalami gangguan perkhidmatan.
Adakah anda usahawan yang sedang menghadapi cabaran dan masalah dalam perniagaan? Kami sedang mencari usahawan yang menghadapi cabaran besar untuk diberi peluang kedua melalui rancangan keusahawanan terbaru. Hantarkan penyertaan anda dengan skan QR yang tertera berserta video berdurasi 1 minit yang menceritakan tentang perniagaan anda dan cabaran utama yang sedang dihadapi. Mungkin ini peluang terakhir anda untuk level up.
Buli di sekolah. Isu ini bukan perkara baru.
Buli tertakluk kepada perbuatan agresif secara fizikal.
Apa sebenarnya jerebu punca utama yang menyumbang kepada masalah ini serta kesannya kepada kesihatan kita?
Mereka akan mengalami iritasi kepada mata. Selain itu, iritasi kepada saluran pernafasan.
Tariffs on imports of products from China reaching up to 145%.
Tariffs on the rest of the world are sitting at 10%, with the potential for reciprocal tariffs to be reimposed within 90 days.
Kunjungan rasmi Presiden China ke Malaysia ini menunjukkan komitmen kedua-dua negara untuk meningkatkan hubungan diplomatik ke tahap yang lebih strategik.
Everything has changed for the global economy. It hasn't shown up in the growth numbers for a bunch of reasons that I'm happy to get into. But be aware that the world is in a very different place.
Welcome to Radio Davos, the podcast from the World Economic Forum that looks at the biggest challenges and how we might solve them. On this episode, we're looking at the state of the global economy and what to look out for in 2026. Find Radio Davos wherever you get podcasts, Spotify, Apple, YouTube, and all our podcasts are at wef.ch/podcasts. From the World Economic Forum, this is Radio Davos. We're recording this video podcast at the annual meeting 2026 in Davos and are joined by one of the world's most distinguished economists. She's the former first Deputy Managing Director and Chief Economist at the International Monetary Fund, and she's now the Gregory and Anya Coffey Professor of Economics at Harvard University, Geeta Gopinath. Geeta, welcome to Radio Davos.
Pleasure to join you, Robin.
So great to have you here. You published an article in the Financial Times a few days before the Davos meeting started. And I'm going to quote you from it. 2025 was a year when everything changed, yet somehow nothing did. What did you mean?
So 2025 was a year when we saw the US impose one of the highest tariff rates that they've had in over a century. Now, they brought it down from extremely high levels, but still the tariff rate was around 14%, much higher than at the start of the year, where it was around 3%. You also had a lot of policy chaos, a lot of confusion about where the rates would settle. And so you would think that that would have been very consequential for the global economy. But if you look at global growth for last year was 3.2%, pretty much exactly what was projected for growth in 2025 the year before, when none of this was on the horizon. It's like nothing happened. And the reason I wrote that piece was to basically make the point that no, please be careful, don't be fooled. Everything has changed for the global economy. It hasn't shown up in the growth numbers for a bunch of reasons that I'm happy to get into. But be aware that the world is in a very different place.
Let's talk about the two things you mentioned then. Why didn't it have that impact that I think a lot of economists were expecting to happen? And then we'll look at maybe what are these fundamental changes that you say. So the first question then is, why did it not, bring GDP growth down?
So there was a time last year when economists thought that this could be highly consequential and even put the US economy in a recession. That was right after Liberation Day and the April 2nd tariffs. So that 3-day window, you saw markets reacting very strongly. It looked like something was going to break. But then what did the Trump administration do? They came and they basically put a pause on those tariffs and said, we're opening up time for negotiation with countries. So one important reason why things turned out better than it was expected was because the actual tariff rates were much lower than what was originally announced would be the tariff rates. And if you look at the true tariffs being paid by firms as they were importing into the US, that's even lower than the statutory rate, which is around 22, 23%. The actual tariff rate in terms of what they pay is 14%.
Why is that? Why is there a discrepancy?
So there are a bunch of reasons for it. One, there have been a lot of exemptions provided to certain products, to certain countries. So tariffs have been announced, but then they've been withdrawn. So the actual tariff rate is very different. And also, if your goods were on the sea when the tariff was imposed, you don't get slapped with a tariff. So there were a lot of exemptions, and that played an important role. Now, the reason why the economy did better than expected was also that there were two important offsets to the world economy. One was AI. That was huge. There was a large amount of investment in AI. Stock markets boomed because of that. That was good for wealth, and that helped hold up consumption at the top end and encourage consumption at the top end of incomes. Countries that were supplying inputs into the AI boom also did really well. Exporters like Taiwan, South Korea, their growth got a big burst because of AI. The second is that fiscal policy, and especially in China, there was a lot of fiscal stimulus in China. Germany announced the moving away from the debt brake rule, and the effect of that is going to play out over the years, in this year and next year. The US economy also has a strong fiscal stimulus this particular year in 2026. So all of that is providing support to an economy that's otherwise being pushed back by tariffs.
And so what has fundamentally changed then? I think you're saying there is still a risk to the downside for economic growth, but are there real fundamental changes that have happened last year that are going to hit us this year?
So the fundamental change that has happened is we've moved away from the rules-based, predictable global trade order. There is a level of uncertainty that wasn't there before. That uncertainty is affecting businesses, especially small businesses. It takes time for that effect to play out. What I'm concerned about is that last year, at least, there was no overall retaliation from all of the US's trading partners. China was the one country that retaliated. Europe did not. But we're starting this year with threats of retaliation from the European Union because of the US's statements on Greenland. Now, that can amplify. But so this world where there's so much uncertainty makes it very hard to make investments and to do business. I like to think of what happened after Brexit. Right after Brexit, there were 2 years when investment continued to go up. And everybody thought, well, this can't really be such a big deal. But then ultimately investment slowed. And 10 years later, you look back and you say, well, this was really a negative effect on the UK economy. I'm not saying that's the exact effect that will be there on the US because the US is a much larger economy than the UK. But still, all of these changes, not just in terms of international policy, but also domestic policy, concerns about questions about central bank independence, those have slower effects, but they do show up over time.
It is an extraordinary time, isn't it, in terms of just the speed of news breaking that someone like you, like economists, is going to change potentially their outlook for their various economic indicators. I mean, since you wrote that article in the Financial Times, Donald Trump's announced more tariffs on Europe because of the Greenland thing. I think that's happened between you writing that and then coming here to Davos. We're recording this for anyone watching or listening on the day before Donald Trump gives his special address here in Davos. So who knows what might have happened in the interim. I mean, just kind of anecdotally, you're someone who's been at the forefront of economic analysis for many, many years. Have you seen a time like this before? Is this a different scene?
Well, I was the chief economist at the IMF when we had the pandemic, and that was something that we hadn't seen in a century. So that was a major shift, and of course we couldn't be in the same room together. We had to be working remotely, so that was dramatic. Compared to that, this is somewhat less dramatic, but still it is a once-in-a-century event with this breakdown of the global order, and we may just be at the beginning of all of this happening. To your previous question about what is long-lasting, I think what's long-lasting is the complete breakdown of trust between the US and the Europe. I mean, that alliance was a critical part of the global economic order. And the fact that that is being ruptured is very consequential.
Again, maybe by the end of this Davos week and next week when this goes out, we'll know if things are being smoothed out, that relationship, or things are getting tough and there's more of a trade war. We just don't know right now sitting here, do we?
We don't know, but I do believe we are never going back to the time when Europe said that they could rely completely on partnership with the US on their security and on an economic partnership. That has changed fundamentally. I think Europe is looking for strategic autonomy. They are figuring out how to rely less on payments that are dominated by US companies. More generally, how to rely on their own internal economy, their own internal security. So there's no going back on that, regardless of how this week goes.
Let's talk about economic growth. In your article, you said, I quote, "The global economy is more fragile than headline numbers suggest." So what are the main risks? You've already described the potential kind of delayed impact of increased tariffs. Are there others?
So the sector that did incredibly well last year was artificial intelligence. That was a big boost to the global economy. I think that's a sector where there is still a lot of fragility. When I wrote the article, I wrote an article last year in The Economist around October, where I said that if you had a dot-com-like bust, it would wipe out $35 trillion of wealth. That is many multiples of what happened during the dot-com. It's a much bigger share of current world GDP than it was during the dot-com. So it can be much more consequential.
How does it compare to that kind of 2008, 2009 recession?
So that was a different crisis. The 2008, 2009, you had also a big financial crisis, but that affected banks. It was much more deeper. It came through the housing sector. It was different. This comparison is more like the dot-com because it's all about tech and what could happen if you have a tech boom that ultimately doesn't deliver on its promise, especially in terms of profitability. So I still think we're in a space where the valuations are stretched. It is difficult for me to see how in this hyper-competitive environment, all of these companies could make the kinds of profits that justify their level of valuations that we're seeing now. So we could see corrections. That's not a statement of the technology. I think the technology is going to be great. But whether all of these companies are going to make the size of profits that justify their valuations, I still have questions on that. So I think that is a very important risk to keep in mind because financial conditions are actually quite easy everywhere in the world, though it keeps changing on a daily basis depending upon news coming in. But that is the shoe that did not drop. We did not have a financial crisis despite 5 years of pandemic, Russia invading Ukraine, interest rates going up very sharply. Could we be building up to a financial crisis? I am concerned about that.
I bet people ask you every day, okay, if there's a bubble, when is it going to burst? And how do you answer that?
Yeah, there is no formula for predicting exactly when a bubble will burst. It could take some time. Usually there's a trigger. One of the triggers, which is what happened last time, right before the dot-com bust, was the Federal Reserve raised interest rate because they were worried about inflation. Could we have a situation this time too that the Fed needs to raise interest rates because of tariffs, additional tariffs being put on, which gets passed through into consumer prices because of the otherwise general high levels of demand in the US that we're seeing? So if there is surprise inflation and the Fed has to raise interest rates, which is not something markets are expecting, then you could see a sudden tightening in financial conditions, and that could prick a bubble.
Let's talk about the Fed then. There is some pressure on it from the political side, from President Trump. I mean, how important is it? Is it an orthodox view that central banks should be independent of the political cycle so that they can set long-term policies that can contain inflation. What do you see? Is that a risk that might be eroded, that kind of independence in the US and potentially elsewhere?
So I'd say there are two kinds of policies on which economists agree. One is that trade helps countries and people. And yes, it may have some flaws and it needs to be carefully managed, but in general, it is a positive. The second is central bank independence, which is that if you want to have low inflation in your country, which then will keep interest rates low for you, you do need to have an independent central bank. Now, to be clear, when we say independent central bank, that does not mean the central bank is not accountable to anybody. This is about operational independence, which is given the mandate that has come from the political class, from Congress in the case of the US, given that mandate, the actual execution of that mandate stays within an independent central bank.
Let's go back to these risks to growth then. You mentioned the potential of a tech bubble or something like the dot-com bubble a couple of decades ago. There are geopolitical risks, aren't there? We've already mentioned Greenland, Iran, Venezuela, all places that America is potentially involved in. There are always geopolitical risks, aren't there? Do you think we're at a particularly risky moment?
Now, the geopolitical risks we're seeing right now are profound for at least our generation, if not for at least two generations at this point. We had 80 years of a peace dividend, especially after 1990 and the end of the Cold War. You had countries coming together, closer integration, peace, and there was growth. It was not perfect. It was absolutely the case that there were jobs that were lost in some countries because of too much of open trade. That was a risk that I think we all have to deal with now. But that said, what we're seeing now, especially with this shift in terms of the relation between US and Europe, that is something that I don't think anybody predicted last year in Davos. There was the sense that we could see some decoupling between the West and China. But the fact that there would be a breaking up of the alliance of the West is not something that we predicted.
And is that something that has global implications, or is it just Europe needs to sort itself out? Or is China looking and Russia is looking and the global South is looking at that relationship between the USA and Europe?
It has huge global implications. If you look at Europe itself, I mean, Europe is now going and making trade relations with other countries. The deal on Mercosur, which they signed recently, they've been working on it for many, many years. And though there's still been pushback from member states, they pushed it through. I think it's a statement about the fact that Europe says, well, we need to have some other friends maybe and build those other relationships. Similarly, in their dealings with China. So the global order is being shifted around. Who you work with, new alliances are being formed, however temporary they may be, but you are seeing those shifts happen. This is a very consequential relation between the US and Europe. And ruptures of the kind that we're seeing will have big implications for everyone.
Another risk that economists always flag up is debt. National debt, government debt being a big risk. Is that just being overshadowed? It's still there, right? But is it being overshadowed by these other things?
If we didn't have this large scale of geopolitical tension and tariffs, that's the risk we would be talking about, which is debt. The fact that almost all countries in the world are sitting on record high levels of debt without a clear path on how that will be brought down is indeed a very important risk that we are facing, in addition to everything else that we have.
So where can it come from? You pointed out over the last year, massive growth stimulated by investment in AI, which had knock-on effects around the world. You're worried to whatever extent that this might be a bubble. Are there other areas that we could achieve economic growth?
I do think AI will help with economic growth. There are going to be productivity effects, whether it takes a couple of years or longer, we have to see. But I think that is an important source of growth because it's a general purpose technology. It can transform all fields that we're looking at, right? Of course, what we do need to keep our eye on is what's happening with jobs. So are we going to be creating growth that is jobless? And that is a risk that we do need to worry about. And I am concerned that especially if this transformation happens very rapidly, where there's a real risk of that happening, you could end up with a shrinking of the middle class and leading to civil, conflict, people protesting. People will not stay quiet in the face of it, lots of people losing their jobs.
How long do you think that will take to kind of...
At this moment, given what we know, I think it's quite uncertain. The effect on productivity, we still have a fairly wide range of estimates, anywhere between adding 0.1% to productivity growth on a yearly basis to 1.5% to productivity growth. So there is a big range over there. Similarly, the impact on jobs, there is a concern that young people coming on the job market are having a harder time finding jobs because of the ability of AI to replace them. But at the same time, there are also young people who are going much more quickly into entrepreneurship because the technology helps them start new enterprises. So we're still in the phase of figuring this out.
The energy price and the oil price is something that is very important when it comes to how the economy functions. I wonder whether, again, that's something like you said, everything changed, nothing changed. You've had the intervention in Venezuela. You've got concerns over what might happen in Iran, these countries with massive fossil fuel reserves. But the oil price, I don't think, has changed that much compared to how dramatic the geopolitical situation is. Where do you see the oil price and energy prices in general going?
So energy prices are, oil especially is going to be in the low 60s. That's the most likely outcome. The reason why Venezuela didn't have any big effect is because even though it has a large amount of supply, getting that out of the ground is going to take time. There's been such damage to their infrastructure that this is not going to happen overnight. That will take time. Iran is like about 1% of the oil market. So it is consequential, but it is not a huge effect on oil markets as such. And there's a lot of supply coming from other parts of the world.
What about the energy transition? Because that was often touted, not least here in Davos, as a driver of growth, investment in new types of energy or different types of energy, green energy, energy storage. We're hearing less about that maybe in the headlines right now. Is there still an energy transition going on, and is it somewhere that people should be investing in and looking for growth?
There is an energy transition going on, and for several countries, especially for emerging and developing countries that otherwise would import a lot of their energy, that is a source of growth for them. It's not just about sustainability, but it's also just about job creation and having to rely less on imported fuel. This is going to be a big source, important source of growth for them. They're investing in it. Solar, wind, hydro, all of those different forms of sustainable energy. That's a direction in which that will continue. I mean, China is doing a lot. I think China is continuing to be on the forefront of the green transition. India is also paying attention, doing the investments that are needed. Pollution is a big challenge in India right now. So even if you are not so worried about sustainability from a global perspective, the fact that you have to get rid of the high levels of pollution itself will move you in the green direction. And weather events are highly consequential for the world, and that will remain the case.
You mentioned China. I wonder if you can just give us an overview of where you see China's economy going, because it's a very different type of economy to the places we've mostly been talking about up till now, North America and Europe.
China has relied quite a bit on export-led growth in these last 2 years, because if you look at domestic consumption, that has been fairly weak, and they haven't solved that problem. So in China, growth for 2025 is around 5%. It's projected to go down to 4.5%. They still have a problem with their property sector. There was overinvestment in that particular sector. We still haven't seen reallocation of resources away from property to other markets sufficiently. That is still a challenge. It's an aging population. The population shrank for the 4th year in a row. That's another headwind. And productivity growth in China has not been very strong. So for all those reasons, if you look out into the medium term, we should expect China's growth to slow to around 3.5% or so. China cannot rely on export-driven growth for multiple reasons. One, it's just too large an economy to be able to grow just on the export side. Secondly, other countries are not going to take in such large amounts of goods. They will slap tariffs very quickly, and they would be justified to do that even by WTO rules because of anti-dumping reasons. So China does need to move towards a growth strategy that is more domestic demand driven. That's going to require stronger social safety nets for households in China so that people don't feel like they have to save that much. And they have to invest in productivity, moving away from state-owned capital to moving towards much more private enterprise.
And will that, they've made a start in that. Do you see that continuing?
They had made a big shift in that right after the great financial crisis. But then I think after the pandemic, they seem to have drifted sideways, again, back into export-led growth. The most recent 15 plan that they came up with still talks about investing in the new sectors, in frontier sectors like AI, frontier energy sectors, and so on, and not enough on the need to have high levels of consumption. So I'm not sure that they've made the switch. I think maybe silently, quietly, they recognize that they cannot have overproduction in every sector. That is a problem because you can end up with, having to worry about prices going too low, which is a problem that China has and no other country does. So they need to do more in terms of reorienting the economy inwards, relying more on consumption, local demand-driven growth, as opposed to external growth. I don't see a big dramatic shift in the policies being made, so this is going to take time. I suspect they'll only move slowly.
Industrial policy. This used to be seen as a thing of the past. Certainly in the West, governments getting involved in economies that many economists would say, let the market sort this out. It's come back, hasn't it? Where do you see industrial policy going from here?
So industrial policy has been around for a while, and I would say China did do a lot of it for many, many years. It's not just in the form of providing a direct subsidy or a tax break to companies, but also in terms of cheap credit and cheap land. That generated very large amounts of production capacity in many different sectors, including automobiles, electric vehicles, but also solar and so on. In the case of China. Now, other countries are also reacting partly to what happened in China, but also now there is a big concern, especially after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, about national security concerns. And so there is this need to encourage certain kinds of sectors at home, be it chips, be it rare earths, be it energy, be it defense, to ensure that you have some level of national security that's still maintained. So I expect industrial policy is going to be here for a while. It is still important, though, to have guardrails because you could end up in a situation where governments are spending a whole lot of money, which they just cannot afford given their level of debt. So to do it, if you were going to do it in a targeted manner on a temporary basis is going to be very important.
What are the risks of it, though, if it's done badly?
If it's done badly, firstly, you're not going to get any of the benefits of the industrial policy because you end up with misallocating resources, and you don't see that in growth, and you don't see that in enough jobs being created. That would be one consequence. The second, of course, is if you end up spending a whole lot and the economy doesn't grow, then your debt as ratio